What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and usually on Mondays I review X-Men storylines, talk about what I liked, what I didn't like. This Monday I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to talk about the aftermath of the X-Men Onslaught saga. What happened and what I feel like should have happened. Some of the stuff that did happen in the aftermath of this story I feel like was okay, and then some of the stuff that happened I feel like could have been handled a lot better. For one thing, you had in the aftermath of this story, most of the mainstream heroes of the Marvel Universe were shunted off into an alternate reality. You had the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. They were more or less rebooted. They were in an alternate reality where people like the X-Men and some of the lesser-known Avengers, they remembered these characters in the Marvel Universe, but these other characters like Iron Man and Captain America, they did not remember the X-Men or some of the other Avengers like Quicksilver or Luna or someone like that. They did not remember those guys. They were kind of living in their own somewhat rebooted alternate reality created by Franklin Richards, and that was its own thing called Heroes Reborn, and then eventually Heroes Return, where they came back to the Marvel 616 universe. But I didn't really want to talk about that. I mostly wanted to talk about the aftermath as it concerns the X-Men. You had in this story, if you haven't read the Onslaught story, there will be some spoilers in this video, obviously, but in the Onslaught story, you basically find out that the roots of this story go all the way back to the previous big X-Men crossover event, Fatal Attractions, where in a fit of rage, Charles Xavier mind-wiped Magneto because Magneto had pulled all the adamantium out of Wolverine's body. And so Charles was just furious and angry, and so he acted violently against his longtime friend Magneto. And then, ever since then, he's basically been dealing with the consequences of that, basically feeling like he betrayed himself, he betrayed his best friend, he did something that he swore he would never do, and that moment led to the creation of Onslaught. And it's kind of complicated how it worked, but basically, Onslaught is the worst aspects of both Magneto and Charles Xavier. Neither guy is 100% good or evil. They both have good and evil aspects in them. Depending on who is writing Magneto, sometimes he's written as a tragic anti-hero who just happens to be seen as evil by the rest of the world. And then sometimes he's written as a straight-up near-Nazi who's willing to kill everyone just to get what he wants. And then Charles Xavier, depending on who's writing him, he's a near-saint who represents all that is pure and good in the world. And then sometimes, pretty much since around this point, he was starting to be written as a dude who was very morally ambivalent and was willing to do very shady things in order to achieve his goals of peaceful coexistence with humans and mutants. So, in a way, not very different from how Magneto is being portrayed. But at this point, Onslaught, he's kind of the worst aspects of both of those guys. And in the aftermath of this story, Charles Xavier was taken into custody by the U.S. government. And we see that in the next storyline that followed the Onslaught story, which was the Operation Zero Tolerance story. And that story itself was, in my opinion, a pretty good story, where Charles Xavier was more or less minimalized as a presence in the life of the X-Men. They continued doing their X-Men thing. They continued living at the Xavier Mansion, but Xavier himself was in custody at the U.S. government, and he wasn't really helping the X-Men anymore. And I feel like this is where my idea of what would have been a really cool way to handle this story comes in. Magneto, as I mentioned, he was mind-wiped in the Fatal Attraction story, and he does show up very briefly in this particular volume of the Onslaught saga. And here's where I feel like the story should have gone. The X-Men find out that Charles Xavier is actually Onslaught, that he has this dark side inside him, and basically this dark side is a combination of Magneto and Charles Xavier. And then after this story, the X-Men decide, okay, we do not trust Charles Xavier anymore. This guy almost destroyed the entire world. He killed the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. As far as the X-Men are concerned, those guys are all dead. We do not trust this guy anymore. And so this would explain why the X-Men are not going to go and bust down the doors of the U.S. government and rescue their longtime mentor, because he's a liability. And if they go and rescue him, what are they going to do with him? Are they going to let him roam the earth freely? Are they going to let him join up their group again? Probably not. A lot of them probably are going to be very wary of Charles Xavier at this point after he became Onslaught. So I would have the X-Men basically go through a period period of a year or two where they really don't like Charles Xavier, and some of them are even thinking about leaving the X-Men because the X-Men remind them too much of this guy who once upon a time they respected, but now it's like, okay, I don't like this. I don't like the X-Men. I don't like Charles Xavier. This leaves a sour taste in my mouth. So you might could have a few of the not so incredibly important characters leave the X-Men for a period of time. So you've got Charles Xavier. He's been kidnapped by the government. Then you might could have Gambit or Bishop, characters like that who say, you know what, I'm done with this life. And then they leave. And of course, eventually they would come back saying, you know what, this was a really bad moment of my life, but I want to forgive Charles Xavier. I want to come back to the X-Men. I have to do what's right. I have to help save the world, and that means joining the X-Men once again. And here's where I think things could have been very interesting. Magneto, at this time, was mind-wiped. And basically, after this story, it took a few more years, but Magneto basically went back to being the evil, mustache-twirling, mwahaha, I'm going to destroy all of the humans, and I'm going to lead the mutants into an era of peace and prosperity. He became that kind of character again a few years after the Onslaught story. There was a story where he once again became kind of the evil mutant terrorist character that he was back in the 1960s and 70s, and then the United Nations gave him the mutant country of Genosha, where he was able to enact all of his ideas and ideals on a large planetary scale on this island. And then the rest of the world is even more terrified of him than they used to be. I would have changed that a little bit. Instead of having it take a few more years for Magneto to basically go back to being the evil supervillain that he was back in the 60s and 70s, I would have had Magneto become the new leader of the X-Men. And here's where things would get even more different from how they played out in the comics. You see, Magneto, once upon a time in the 1980s, he was the headmaster of the school. Charles Xavier, long story short, had been fatally wounded, and he had to go into outer space where they had this super medicine that could heal him. But then, while he was in outer space, all of the Stargate technology was destroyed. So Charles Xavier is like billions and billions of light years on the other side of the universe, and he can't get back to the X-Men. And before he left, he said to Magneto, listen, I want you to lead the X-Men. I want you to be the headmaster of the New Mutants. And Magneto had slowly been going through this transition of being an enemy of the X-Men to occasionally being an ally of the X-Men. For example, God Loves, Man Kills, and Secret Wars, he worked with the X-Men, and then slowly just being an ally of the X-Men. So by this point, this wasn't an incredibly weird thing for Charles Xavier to ask of his longtime friend. And so for about 5 years, Magneto was a good guy. He was working with the X-Men, and at first, a lot of the X-Men were very wary of it. It's like, you know, this is a guy who's tried to kill us before. I've tried to kill him, as Wolverine would probably say. This is something that we're not really very comfortable with. But by the end of the 80s, it was almost status quo. It's like, yeah, Magneto's part of the X-Men. What of it? It's not really a weird thing to think about it anymore. I would have used the Onslaught story, or the aftermath of the Onslaught story, I would have used it as a transition to get Magneto and the X-Men back to that point. But since Magneto's mind has been completely wiped, this would be as organic of a way as getting back to that story and that status quo as you could possibly have in the comics, since Magneto had kind of sort of been reverted back to villainy in the early 90s. He was basically back to being at a point where I don't work with the X-Men anymore, but I'm not the mustache-twirling supervillain either. I'm kind of the tragic anti-hero, and that's where we saw him last at the end of the Chris Claremont era in the very early 90s. And then Fatal Attractions comes along, and he's basically a little bit more mustache-twirly at that point, and then Charles Xavier wipes his mind. And I feel like this would have been a really perfect way to have him slowly regain his memories. Maybe he sees on the TV that the X-Men are fighting this giant monstrosity called Onslaught, and then suddenly he has memories of working with these guys. It's like, that guy with the claws, I remember him. And that guy right there, I remember him with the optic blast. And he starts to put the pieces together that he is not just some dude with amnesia. He's actually Magneto, the master of magnetism. And he might go to the library and look himself up, and he might quickly realize Magneto is actually not really a good dude. The world hates Magneto, and they really don't like him. And he says, you know what? I'm in danger out here. When I'm hanging out in the middle of South Carolina eating lunch with these Homo sapiens who, not too long ago, I would have been hunting them down and killing them for being Homo sapiens, I need to get away from these people, because if they find out who I am, then I'm in danger. So he would go back to the X-Men all of his memories haven't quite returned to him, but he knows just enough that he knows he needs to be with them for his own safety, and he also remembers just enough of them to know that if they read his mind and know that he's sincere, they will take him in as well. And then this would be a really good way to take everything about the X-Men up until this point and turn it on its head, while also kind of sort of returning to an area of familiarity from the 1980s. You have Magneto once again working with the X-Men, but it's in a different way than what had happened before, and it's not just, oh, we're returning to the well, we're doing that one thing that we did about 10 years ago. You're doing the same thing that you did about 10 years ago, but it's done in such a different way that, in my opinion, it could have produced a lot of very interesting stories. Now, of course, they didn't go in that direction, but here we are in 2015, 2016, and Magneto is once again with the X-Men, and has been for the last 5 years or so. So it's not like it's completely unheard of for Magneto to go back and forth from being an enemy of the X-Men to being a part of the X-Men. And I feel like it would have been a really nice opportunity to have Magneto join the X-Men, slowly start to regain his memories. Maybe at some point you could even play around with the idea that all of his memories are back now, and he remembers being an enemy of the X-Men, and he remembers all of these reasons that he was an enemy of humankind and an enemy of the X-Men, but he would say, you know what? All of that is behind me now. There's no reason that any of these guys need to know that all of my memories are back. I'm part of them now. I'm one of the X-Men. I'm helping them try to save the world in the absence of my old friend and their old mentor. And it would have been really interesting to slowly have Magneto, every time someone like Wolverine says, yeah, Charles Xavier's a scumbag, and he became Onslaught, and he almost killed us, and now he's given mutants an even worse name than what we already had before. Magneto could be the voice of reason. He could be the guy who says, yeah, he did all those bad things, but he's also the reason that all of you guys are alive. He saved your lives on multiple occasions. It would have been really neat to see Magneto kind of playing a different character than what he had played before. And I will admit, part of my reason for thinking this would have been neat to see play out in the Marvel Universe is that I've always found Magneto to be more interesting when he's not 100% bad, when he's more on the side of the good guys, maybe not 100% good, but on the side of the good guys with a touch of bad. I feel like that's the most interesting way to play Magneto, and unfortunately I feel like most other people disagree. Most people think that he's much better when he's on the side of the bad guys, leading the Brotherhood, or going against the rest of humankind. I just feel like we've seen Magneto as an enemy of humankind so often that it seems like it's almost gotten old and uninteresting. I won't go that far, but I feel like it would be more interesting to have him working with the X-Men and being more in the hero side of things a little more often than what we see him as. So, those are my thoughts. What did you guys think of this Missed Opportunities video? What do you think of the idea of using the Onslaught saga as a way of getting Charles Xavier away from the X-Men and getting Magneto back into the X-Men? And of course, after a few years of having Magneto not really leading the X-Men, but kind of being among them and sort of being their unofficial mentor figure, but you would have someone like Scott or Storm be the official leader of the X-Men. After a few years of that, you would have Charles Xavier come back, and then it's like, oh boy, what do we do now? Are we going to kick out Magneto now that Charles is back? Do we take Charles back in? There would be a very fertile ground for lots of different stories to play out here. I really think it would have been interesting. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back later in the week with some other videos. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.